Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, the Weeb Union, and in this one we have a lot of developments in the Kursk region since I skipped over it in my last update. And we have a few developments in the east, with the Russians capturing yet another 6 square kilometers in the Pokrovsk section, where they've managed to capture the village of Orelivka and about half of Shuravka to the north of it. The Russians made a move from the high grounds after capturing the fortified positions here in the eastern parts, the high grounds. They then made use of that, both the control over the fortified positions and the high grounds, to gain control over Relivka and Shuravka fairly quickly. At the same time, with the push towards Mykolaiivka, the battle over Novohrodivka will now begin, with the capture of Orelivka and the push towards Shuravka as well. So we see that the Russian offensive operations continue at a heightened pace following the start of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. This has led to the Russians capturing a lot of territory this month, only in the first half of it, leading to the Battle of Novohrodivka and Horodivka starting, and it may be the case that the Russians manage to capture both of these towns by the end of this month, which would lead to the Russians reaching Pokrovsk and Mironograd at the end of this month or at the start of the next one. The Russian advance here in the direction of Orelivka has been adjudicated with this footage here of the Russians positioning themselves in the central parts of Shuravka in the north, along the Shuravka river. Further south in the direction of Volodar, there has also been this advance here, where the Russians have managed to capture 2 more forest lines as they advance closer towards Volodar. This now marks about 6 kilometers in a straight line from the positions they had prior to the offensive operations in this direction, and that means that they are now closer to Volodar right now to their positions here compared to their starting positions. It's about 5 kilometers from the current positions towards Volodar. We see offensive operations continue by the Russians along the entirety of the road from the southern to the northern parts, and we may see the start of, or the restart of, the Battle of Volodar. In the New York section of the front line, we have seen a significant advance by the Russians. First off, they captured the entirety of the western parts along the road and some of the fortified positions along it, where they now have a strong flank against the Ukrainian positions to the west. This is something that they did not achieve ahead of them capturing positions in the northwestern parts of the city. This led to the Ukrainians being able to counterattack with control over 3/4 of the area. But now that the Russians have managed to capture the western parts, they may be able to re-enter and recapture the positions northwest of the city, which could pretty much lead to the full capture of the city, as right now the Russians have also made a breakthrough in the central parts, where they've managed to cross over the river and gain control over the central parts and the railway station in New York, leading to only the industrial area and the central parts, a few residential areas in the eastern parts, the park and school area in the eastern parts, the northern parts, and the western parts under Ukrainian control. At the same time, the Russians have now fully captured everything east and southeast of New York, securing the eastern flank as well. This means that the Russians can now concentrate their forces across the river line to gain full control over the residential area and the industrial area in the eastern parts, which would completely isolate the western part from any of its supply lines or support areas. And this could lead to the Russians attacking it from multiple directions, from the western parts, eastern parts, southern parts, and even flank it from the northern parts to gain control of it. This could force the Ukrainians to withdraw back to the fortified positions along the forest lines, and this would lead to the Russians gaining full control over New York. The Ukrainian fortified positions along the forest areas are located on the high ground at an elevation of about 186 meters. Further north, they decrease, but the area in which the villages are located on are also even further down south at about 100 meters. There is a 50 to 80 meter advantage for the Ukrainian positions in the heights compared to the residential area. This means that the Russians would likely look to gain full control over New York and completely forget about Toretsk to then work on the Ukrainian fortified positions located in the heights northwest of the city. The fortified positions here in the northwest of New York are very dense. We see that there are several along the village area. This is to have a strong flank towards them to prevent the Russians from simply running through the village area, through New York and upwards. This will be very difficult for the Russians because it would be constantly under fire from the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the heights. Instead, it is likely that the Russians will look to gain control over the northwestern parts of New York and then take that as an advantage to push along the forest areas to gain control over the southern fortified positions and then move along the forest lines northwards. This is to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions. Instead of going through from Nelibivka, they will go through from the northwestern parts. However, they need to strengthen their western flank, and this is why this village chain from Oleksandropil in the south to Sukhabelka in the north needs to go under Russian control if they are to advance beyond New York. Now that is all for the southern and eastern front line. We then move on to the Kursk update, which has been delayed. We start out in the south, where the Ukrainians managed to capture the rest of the village of Plechovo, and they've also managed to capture Burki. This is isolated by the Sel River, which goes through the northern parts here. And through this river line, the Ukrainians will have a strong northern flank, where they have managed to capture everything to the southern bank of it and are moving along it. This is why the Ukrainians have been able to advance this much with little resistance, because the majority of the Russian forces are to the north of this river line. The Russians were initially pushed back all the way towards Belaya and even Ivanovsky, but following the Ukrainian incursion, the Russians sent additional troops to this area, where they managed to stabilize the front line and have since pushed it back to Giri, where now fighting is taking place by Kamishnoe, and this is according to this footage here, where we see geolocated positions of the Ukrainians here in the southeastern parts. Based on this, it is clear that it is not a strong force of the Ukrainians here in the south, but rather a diversionary group, which their objective is simply to spread the Russian forces thin. This advance took place ahead of the Ukrainians starting a push in the west. Currently, the main Ukrainian focus is taking place here in the western parts of their foothold in the Kursk region. They have entered into the southwestern parts, where they've captured 3 villages, which were largely left undefended, so the Ukrainians went in, removed the Russian flag, planted the Ukrainian flag, and put up positions to start defending those against a Russian counterattack. At the same time, launched an attack here in the northwestern parts to cut off the railway and start a push towards Krasnochebrosk. So we see that the Ukrainians are pushing towards the southern flank of Korenevo. There's also DRG activity inside Korenevo, the eastern parts of it, because the town itself is separated by the Reka River. So we see that the Ukrainians are active in the southern bank of the river line, while the Russians have full control over the western parts. But only DRG activity is within Korenevo. The main part of the Ukrainian forces have not been able to gain a foothold yet, but heavy fighting is taking place in the eastern parts. At the same time, the Ukrainians are working on flanking Korenevo by attacking here towards the eastern parts, Shiravli. But again, we have only seen some DRG activity. There's no genuine push towards the Russian positions there. And at the same time, we are also seeing pushes towards Vetreno. So there are current fighting is taking place towards Kremyanoe, Shiravli, and Vetreno, whereas additional pushes towards Krasnochebrosk. Based on these developments, we see that the Ukrainians' main focus right now is to push towards Korenevo, and at the same time some DRG is still taking place in the northern parts. This is pointing towards the Ukrainians wanting to strengthen their flank by gaining control over Korenevo, as that is the strongest locality in the area. And at the same time, with the reported full capture of Sutia, it is still being contested, as there are contradicting claims to this. Deep State Map claims that it is fully under Ukrainian control, while some pro-Russian sources claim it isn't, and Syriac Maps has left it as this. This indicates that there is still Russian positions in the eastern parts of it, and the Ukrainians are still fighting over it. So we see, based on this, that the Ukrainians strengthening their flank in the east along Sutia, and has pushed additionally towards the eastern parts to redirect Russian forces and spread them out thinner. At the same time, Ukrainian forces have pushed towards the western flank, while they're also trying to establish a strong flank in the west. So the objective of the Ukrainians here is to create strong flanks both in the east and in the west to make the main push in the center. Strengthening the flanks and taking in is a clear indication of an upcoming offensive, and this likely means that there's going to be a second major push by the Ukrainians. They'll likely rotate in new forces and then start a push towards Lvov. The issue here for the Ukrainians is that the Russians have started creating significant defensive positions by Lvov. In just a few days, they managed to take a multi-kilometer long anti-tank ditch, which, if the Ukrainians want to pass through, they would need engineering units to create bridges. Therefore, we can conclude that the initial surprise the Ukrainians got with their surprise offensive, the initial advantages gained thereof, are now spent. The Russians are establishing a front line, they're creating new defensive positions, and they're going to stop the Ukrainian advance by building fortifications just like they did in the south. The Ukrainians now, the longer they stay, the more difficult the situation will become. We're seeing that they are still constantly advancing, but they're mostly in areas where the Russians have yet to plug the gaps. In the end, wherever the Russian forces are, the Ukrainians are really struggling to advance, despite this being some of their most elite units. But this shows that the Russian defensive capabilities are not weakened or spent. Instead, they are just getting started, and we're going to be looking to some additional Russian counterattacks. We're already seeing some here in Nikolaevka and Malaya Luknia, where the Russians managed to recapture Nikolaevka and start pushing back towards Malaya Luknia, which is in one of the main areas. Sure, there are DRGs in the gap between these two positions, but these are all just open fields with a lot of forest areas, where the Ukrainians have made use of these forests as cover to avoid detection by Russian UAVs to reach deep into Russian lines, but as soon as they reach the village areas, they become unable to push further. This is why we're now having our full attention towards Korenevo, as that is a place where this entire operation may be decided. If the Ukrainians are able to capture Korenevo, then they will be able to push further. If they fail to capture Korenevo, then the whole offensive could be stopped right there. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.